Hi, I'm Robin.
And I'm Chris. Together we're the Gen X couple.
Guys.
Take one. Hello, everyone.
So I'm pretty excited today. You guys, it's still March. Today is March 21st. You guys won't hear this till April because we're scheduling out, but I did it. Whenever Christian mispronounces a word, you're going to hear that sound. And I'm going to get great joy out of this.
I might have to do it for every time you giggle.
That wasn't a giggle, that was a chuckle.
Same thing.
That was a laugh.
Same thing.
Idjit! We've told you what idjit's from before, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Then I won't remind you. You just have to go back. If you don't know, you'll have to go back and try to find it. That'll be like a little Easter egg.
It was.
Anyway, welcome back, you guys. I'm excited about this one. Today we're heading up north to a place that may look very peaceful, scenic, and honestly like the perfect spot for a quiet weekend vacation. But beneath that calm surface is one of the most remarkable underwater museums in North America. And I'm talking about North. Oh, look, that was myself. I'm talking about Lake Champlain, which is in the north. It's north of us, but we're talking about Lake Champlain. And it's a long, narrow lake that sits between Vermont and it stretches all the way up to Quebec. And New York is in there somewhere too, but I focus on the Vermont side because I've only ever seen it on the Vermont side. For centuries, it served as a major transportation corridor, and because of that history, the lake has collected an incredible amount of shipwrecks. Historians estimate that there are more than 300 vessels that have sunk in the waters of Lake Champlain, and many of them are still sitting down there pretty much intact.
And that's one of the things that makes Lake Champlain so fascinating.
Champlain? Yeah.
So fascinating to archaeologists
So we're off.
and divers. The lake is cold and it's fresh water, which means the kinds of organisms that usually eat shipwrecks in the ocean simply aren't present here. In saltwater environments, wooden ships get destroyed by shipworms and bacteria very quickly. I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
In Lake Champlain, the wood can...
Champlain,
the wood can survive for centuries. So when divers discover a wreck here, they sometimes find something that looks almost frozen in time, with decks, masts, cargo, and tools still where they were the day the vessel went down.
Yeah, another reason the lake has so many wrecks is geography. Lake Champlain is long and narrow, like I mentioned before, and storms can whip up suddenly along the valley. I messed up. See, I'll do it for myself too. Wind gets funneled down the lake and waves can build up really fast, especially during the fall shipping season. Combine that with heavy commercial traffic in the late 1700s and 1800s, and you get a recipe for accidents. Ships ran aground on reefs, they caught fire, they collided with other vessels, or simply just got overwhelmed by the sudden storms. Each wreck tells a story about the people who worked on the lake and the goods that moved through the region.
And today we're going to explore several of the most fascinating shipwrecks discovered in the lake. Some of these date back to the American Revolution, when the lake was essentially a battlefield. Others came from an era of steamships and cargo schooners. Schooners. When the lake functioned like the busy highway for commerce. The stories involve warships, passenger steamers, strange mechanical ferries powered by horses, and cargo vessels loaded with iron, ore, or stone. And every one of them adds a piece to the puzzle of how people lived and worked along this lake the past 200 years.
250 years even. So let's start with one of the most extraordinary discoveries ever made in Lake Champlain. In 1997, underwater archaeologists located the wreck of a small American Revolutionary War gunboat called the Spitfire. This ship had gone down in 1776 during one of the most important naval battles of the early Revolutionary War. For more than 200 years, it remained hidden beneath the lake, just quietly resting in the dark. Well, when researchers finally located it, they realized that they had found something truly rare.
The Spitfire was part of a fleet built by the Continental Army under the command of Benedict Arnold. At the time, the British controlled Canada and were planning to push south down Lake Champlain to split the American colonies in two. Arnold knew the Americans needed some kind of naval presence on the lake to slow them down. So in a matter of months, American shipbuilders rushed to construct a fleet of small warships, including gunboats, schooners, and row galleys. The Spitfire was one of these vessels, designed specifically for the shallow waters and narrow channels of the lake.
A gondola like the Spitfire was essentially a floating artillery platform. It had a flat bottom so it could operate close to the shore, and it carried a handful of cannons along with swivel guns mounted all around the deck. The crew typically numbered around 40 to 50 men, and these vessels were not elegant sailing ships by any stretch of the imagination, but they were practical and heavily armed for their size. They were meant to fire on enemy ships while maneuvering in tight spaces.
So in October of 1776, Arnold's small American fleet encountered the much larger British fleet near Valcour Island. The battle that followed was intense and chaotic. Cannon fire echoed across the narrow channel while smoke from gunpowder drifted over the water. The British fleet had more ships and heavier guns, and eventually Arnold's vessels were overwhelmed, and several American ships were sunk during the fighting or scuttled afterward to keep them from falling into British hands.
The Spitfire ended up going down during that campaign, and for more than 2 centuries, nobody knew exactly where it rested. When archaeologists finally discovered the wreck in 1997, they were stunned by how intact it was. The hull was largely preserved, and one of its cannons was still sitting in its place on the deck. Even the mast remained standing upright. Seeing a Revolutionary War vessel preserved like that underwater is extremely rare. And I should say that I'm surprised Champ, the lake monster in Lake Champlain, didn't hang out on this. How is it just leaving all this stuff be?
I think we've talked about him.
We've mentioned, there is a quote-unquote lake monster in Lake Champlain, and they call it Champ, lovingly.
And their baseball team is named that, too.
It is. They have, what is that called? Not even minor leagues. What's below the minor leagues?
I don't think it's AAA, AA.
I don't even know. But they have a baseball team in Burlington, Vermont, named the Champs, Champs, after Champ.
So the wreck sits in very deep water, which helped protect it from damage over the years. Divers studying the site have described it as one of the best preserved Revolutionary War shipwrecks ever found. It provides archaeologists with valuable information on how these warships were constructed and equipped. Every plank and fastener helps historians understand the hurried shipbuilding efforts of the Continental Army in 1776.
So moving ahead a few decades brings us to another remarkable shipwreck, the steamboat Phoenix. This vessel represents a completely different era on Lake Champlain, when steam power began transforming transportation. The Phoenix was launched in 1815 and quickly became one of the most important passenger vessels operating on the lake. Steamships like this allowed people and goods to travel on very predictable schedules, which is something that wasn't always possible with sailing vessels that depended on wind.
The Phoenix was about 146 feet long and powered by a large steam engine that turned paddle wheels mounted along the sides of the ship. It carried passengers between major lake ports such as Burlington and Plattsburgh. For people living in the early 19th century, traveling on a steamship must have felt incredibly modern and exciting, and these vessels represented the cutting edge of transportation technology at the time.
Yeah, I found it. Never mind. I was going to say I lost my spot on my notes, but I found it. Yeah, you were about to buzz me, but I found it. The Phoenix even carried some very famous passengers. In 1817, President James Monroe traveled aboard the ship during a tour of the northern United States. That tells you something about how important the vessel was. It had become one of the primary ways to move across Lake Champlain quickly and comfortably.
But unfortunately, in September of 1819, disaster struck. The Phoenix had just departed from Burlington when a fire broke out on board. Fires were a constant risk on early steamships because the engines required open flames to heat the boilers. With wooden decks and cabins surrounding those heat sources, a single spark could quickly turn into a dangerous situation.
Passengers and crew rushed to respond to the flames that were spreading across the ship. Accounts from that time describe panic as Accounts from the time describe panic as people tried to escape the burning vessel. Some passengers jumped into the water while others were rescued by nearby boats. Despite the efforts to save everyone, 6 people lost their lives during that incident.
And the burning ship eventually drifted onto the Colchester Reef, where it continued to burn
Colchester Reef.
until much of the upper structure was destroyed. Salvage crews later removed valuable components such as the steam engine, and over time the remaining structure slipped into deeper water and was forgotten.
Didn't we see a show like on Amazon Prime or somewhere where they explored some of these shipwrecks? I've heard this story before I did this research and I can't remember, but I feel like they did like some underwater dives or something. Or maybe I'm just imagining that. Maybe it was a dream. I don't know. Anyway, for more than a century and a half, the wreck of the Phoenix remained hidden beneath the lake. Then in 1978, divers rediscovered it, resting between 60 and 100 feet under the water. Even though much of the ship had burned, the surviving portions still provide an incredible glimpse into the early days of steam travel. Wasn't it Josh Gates? You know that guy from Expedition X?
Yeah.
It was on his show. I
Maybe.
swear I remember that.
He's from the area.
Yeah, he's from Manchester by the Sea, which is the town that the Driftwood Cove mysteries are based on that I write.
Good book.
Great book series. But I feel like it was his show because he went on search of, I think they were looking for treasure maybe?
Yeah.
I don't know. It just came back to me. Sorry.
So the Phoenix wreck is actually considered the oldest known sidewheel steamboat wreck anywhere in the world. And that makes it a very important archaeological site. Studying it helps researchers understand how early steamships were designed and built during the early 19th century.
Another fascinating wreck in the lake belongs to a vessel with one of the most dramatic names you could ever imagine, the Water Witch. I love it. The ship originally began its life as a steamboat built in 1832, but later it was converted into a sailing schooner. Ships were often modified like this as technology changed and the owners tried to extend the life of their vessels.
And by the 1860s, the Water Witch was operating as a cargo schooner on the lake. In April of 1866,
It said Lake Champlain and he just skipped right over
it
it.
set out carrying a heavy load of iron ore. Iron mining was a major industry in the region during that period, and ships like this transported raw materials to smelters and industrial centers. The cargo, though, was extremely heavy.
I feel like we're in a game of Minecraft. Smelting and
Yeah.
iron ore. That's all. Remember when the kids were little and they played it? That's all we heard.
Yeah.
They talked about smelting and what's the black thing?
Creepers.
Creepers and onyx and iron ore. Anyway, unfortunately, the ship was carrying more ore than it should have been. Overloading made the vessel sit lower in the water, which reduced its stability and made it harder to handle rough weather. When a storm moved across the lake, the overloaded schooner struggled to stay afloat.
And the Water Witch eventually sank during the storm, and most of the crew managed to escape, but the tragedy involved the captain's infant child who had been aboard in the cabin. The child did not survive the sinking, which adds to a heartbreaking element to the story.
Yeah, that's more than heartbreaking. Jeez. When divers located the wreck in 1977, they found something pretty cool. The schooner was still standing upright on the lake floor with much of its structure preserved. The masts had collapsed over time, possibly due to Champ, but the hull remained largely intact. Seeing a 19th century cargo schooner preserved like that underwater is super rare.
And researchers have described the wreck as looking like a ghost ship resting in the dark. The cold water of Lake Champlain preserved the wood
Champlain.
and prevented rapid decay. As a result, the Water Witch has become one of the most studied shipwrecks in the lake.
One of the strangest vessels ever discovered in Lake Champlain is something called a horse ferry. If you've never heard of that before, you're definitely not alone. Before steam engines became widespread, some ferries used an unusual form of power. Horses walked on large treadmills inside the vessel, and their movement turned gears connected to the paddle wheels.
So essentially, the horses were providing the energy needed to move the ferry across the water. As they walked, the paddle wheels outside the hull would turn and push the boat forward. It's a fascinating example of early mechanical engineering. These ferries were used in several parts of North America during the late 18th century and early 19th century.
One such ferry operated in Burlington Bay on Lake Champlain. At some point in the early 1800s, the vessel sank and was forgotten. Then, in 1983, divers discovered the wreck while exploring the lake bed. What they found was pretty cool.
Yeah, the structure of the ferry still showed the large mechanical system that once connected the horse treadmill to the paddle wheels. And archaeologists realized they had found one of the only two known horse ferry wrecks in North America. And that makes it a unique piece of transportation history.
Yeah, the idea of horses powering a ferry across the lake may sound unusual today, but at the time it was a really clever solution before steam engines became reliable. The wreck provides a fascinating glimpse into the creativity of early engineers who were trying to move people and goods across waterways.
And the lake was also connected to a network of canals that linked it to the Hudson River
Which
and
we
beyond.
may know from SVU.
Yes.
Because they find people
On
in
the
the
Hudson
Hudson
all the time.
all the time. It's
Every
the only
week.
place, pretty much.
Every week. Because of those connections, cargo vessels known as canal schooners frequently traveled the region carrying supplies and industrial goods. One of those vessels was the O.J. Walker.
In 1895, the O.J. Walker encountered severe weather while traveling on the lake. Storms on Lake Champlain can develop quickly, especially in the fall when the colder air masses begin moving across the region. Waves build rapidly, and the winds can push ships toward dangerous shoals or reefs.
So during the storm, the schooner lost control and eventually sank. Fortunately, the crew survived the incident, but the ship itself settled on the lake floor. And when diners later examined the wreck, they found large sections of the hull still intact, along with structural details that reveal how canal schooners were built in the late 18th century.
The late 18th?
Yeah, 19th century.
Yeah, you said the late 18th. But I'm not going to buzz you for that, because I feel like we've buzzed a lot, but not as much as I thought we were going to, so I'm impressed. Another wreck that divers frequently visit is the tugboat US La Valley, spelled Lavallee. Tugboats played an important role on Lake Champlain by towing barges and assisting larger vessels that needed help navigating narrow channels or docking at the ports. The smaller boats were powerful for their size and worked long hours supporting the lake's shipping industry.
The La Valley eventually reached the end of its working life in the early 20th century. In 1931, the vessel was intentionally sunk in deeper water. The idea was to create an underwater site that could support fish and aqua life, while also serving as a destination for divers.
Today, the tugboat sits upright about 100 feet below the surface. Divers who visit the wreck often report that the engine and many internal components are still visible. It's like stepping into a mechanical time capsule from the early 20th century.
And one of the things that makes this lake shipwrecked so interesting is the number of vessels that sank there. Some were ships, others were passenger steamers, and many were cargo vessels, transporting goods between communities along the lake. And each wreck represents a moment in the economy and social history of the region.
Yeah, and there's also a wreck known simply as the Stone Boat, which carried large blocks of building stone. So I guess it was aptly named. When it sank, those heavy blocks spilled across the lake bed and remain there today. Divers exploring the site can still see the piles of stone scattered around the hull.
And seeing cargo sitting next to a shipwreck really brings history to life. It reminds you that these ships weren't just objects. They were working vessels carrying materials that towns and cities depend on. When one went down, it affected trade routes and the local economy.
Yeah, and what makes Lake Champlain truly special is Champ. But other than Champ, it's the fact that there are so many wrecks that are in such good shape being studied. Archaeologists today use sonar, underwater photography, and remotely operated vehicles to document each site. And each new discovery adds more information about how people built ships, moved cargo, and traveled across the lake.
And still, with all the research that has been done, experts believe that there are many wrecks still out there waiting to be discovered. The lake is large, deep in many areas, and full of places where ships could have gone down without leaving much of a trace.
Yeah, so the next time you're there and you look out across Lake Champlain and see that calm water stretching out towards the horizon, it's worth remembering what's actually beneath the surface. There are centuries of history and a sea monster resting quietly down there. There's stuff from Revolutionary War gunboats to cargo schooners and early steamships.
And each one of those shipwrecks tells a different story about people who sailed these waters and everything that went on. And you might want to keep an eye out for Champy.
Yeah, and that's going to do it for us today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed hearing about this. I'm telling you, there's an episode of Expedition X about this. I'm pretty sure it was that show. I don't know why I have Josh Gates in my mind, because I think it was him down there scuba diving. But I think I have a picture of Lake Champlain, maybe. I need to be better. I took a picture of the buzzer. I'm going to post that to our social media probably soon. And with that, I think you know where to find us. You know, blah, 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 blah. Buy my books. I have a new book coming out May 1st. It's awesome.
All right. See you later, alligator.
In a wild crocodile.